Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod, and this is Star Wars 7x7. So this episode is coming out on Monday, June 4th, and box office totals for Solo's second weekend are already known, but hey, circumstances being what they were, I had to record this episode a few days early, so yeah, I'm doing this without knowing how things turned out. A little nervous making, but... Anyway, the thing that I wanted to throw out there about the whole brand fatigue conversation, and, this is something that Disney's worldwide chief of distribution, Dave Hollis, said, I don't think brand fatigue is an issue because we're in conference rooms talking about releasing Thor and Black Panther and Infinity War in November and February and May, and nobody's talking about brand fatigue about those. And, we've talked about how things are different with the MCU and that the MCU now is not an equivalent comparison to Star Wars right now. They're, more like MCU in 2008, 9, 10, 11 than they are in MCU 2016, 17, 18. But as you've probably noticed over these episodes where we've talked about Solo and its performance, it's really difficult to get a handle on exactly why things are going the way they're going. There are so many different reasons, and each one of them is plausible to a certain degree, so chances are many of the reasons are at play, and it's just a question of, well, which one should be weighted more or less. The brand fatigue thing is rather hard to get a handle on, and you can observe what's going on in the market and come up with a theory about it, but to actually test that theory, well, that seems a bit difficult. But here's what I tried to do in that regard. I'm a member of a few different Facebook groups where Star Wars is a hot topic of conversation. Surprise, surprise. And so I posted in those groups a question about how many times people had seen these four movies in the theater. That would be, of course, The Force Awakens, Rogue One, The Last Jedi, and Solo: A Star Wars Story. And I asked people to estimate for Solo how many times they thought they would see Solo in the theater if they thought they were going to see it more than once going forward. So it's a very informal poll, it's very self-selecting, and you can't necessarily really draw any scientific conclusions from it. Let's just say that right at the start. But here's what generally comes out of the 100+ comments that have been thrown into those polls so far. First of all, the saga movies generally are the ones that people are the most interested in. That's not to say that people aren't interested in the spin-offs like Rogue One or Solo: A Star Wars Story, and in some cases we're actually more impressed with those. It's just that the saga movies are the ones that truly have the deepest draw, that are truly seen as the big event must-see movies, and so, there's a bias toward those comparatively speaking. Additionally, there's also something that you would probably expect to see, which is that there's sort of a bias toward The Force Awakens itself. And that has a lot to do with the pent-up demand for Star Wars in general. It was 10 years before the last Star Wars movie. No, we're not counting the Clone Wars animated movie that was stitched together out of some pilot episodes, or, that doesn't count. We're ignoring that. We're pretending it doesn't exist. We're talking live action movies only. So The Force Awakens generating a lot of viewership because of that pent-up interest, and so everything else after that is going to kind of pale by comparison. Other factors that come into play are the repeat viewing situation, which, I'm already sort of talking about to begin with, but let's just make it clear. I'm talking about repeat viewership here and that driving ticket sales. That was a huge driver of ticket sales for The Force Awakens, and it's definitely not happening as much, according to this very informal poll, for Rogue One and for The Last Jedi and for Solo: A Star Wars Story. I would say that there's probably an asterisk on my statement to that effect in regard to The Last Jedi, because there were some folks who actually said they thought the movie was just so deep and so amazing that it demanded repeated viewings in the theater in a way that The Force Awakens did not. I'm paraphrasing and, concatenating for comments here. So there is, that sort of asterisk on The Last Jedi situation. But a lot of folks did acknowledge that time and money were a significant factor in their decisions and their abilities to see any of the movies. And so when you look at the release date of Solo: A Star Wars Story in the Memorial Day weekend space, where you've got Infinity War that's been running and running strong, and you had Deadpool right before it, and you've got The Incredibles coming up and Jurassic Park Fallen Kingdom. You know, the idea of having less time and less money to spend on movies, or having, you know, only a certain amount of time and a certain amount of money, and knowing that you got to spread it around more at this time of year, well, that is going to ultimately impact the way that people ingest Solo Star Wars story as well. That's not exactly a direct correlation to the whole brand fatigue thing, but, you know, it's playing in the neighborhood thereof. And also in the same neighborhood as well is that whole thing about people not necessarily rushing out to see Solo, a Star Wars story. Part of that is in the neighborhood of brand fatigue, and part of it is the whole, well, it's not a saga movie, the stakes aren't that high, it's not really a space opera in the same way that The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi are. There's not as much at stake. We don't need to see what's going on with the continuing story of these characters. We don't have Luke coming out of the shadows and finding out what's been going on with him or anything like that. So that also is not creating that same psychological pressure for people to have to get out to the movies and see the darn thing, you know? Every once in a while I think about this in terms of how you're probably, sitting at, home watching this, wherever you might be watching it. You may be watching it while you're on a treadmill or something like that. But chances are, if you're wearing underwear right now, you can't actually feel your underwear. And it's the idea that once your nerve endings have gotten used to the idea that you have underwear on, like it's sitting against your skin, right? Like, the nerve endings are firing because they're feeling the sensation of the stuff touching your skin. But eventually the nerve endings just kind of wear out and they're like, okay, yeah, we know there's something there already. Unless there's new news to report, we're not going to send any more nerve impulses about the fact that something's there. And so same kind of thing with Solo. Like, we all know it's there. We all know that it's a Star Wars movie, but we also know that, we're not going to be too out of the loop on things if we are not there immediately. So another thing that plays into the fatigue kind of situation, if you will. And so I think we're going to stop talking about brand fatigue from now on. We're going to talk about how the movie performed over the weekend on tomorrow's episode, and we'll see if brand fatigue comes up in the conversation again or if it's something else entirely. But for now, we'll just let it stand pat and see what you think. Over on the audio version of the podcast, I'm going to do Last Jedi Trivia. That's at sw7x7.com/iTunes or wherever you like to listen to podcasts. So please do check that out. But for now, it just remains for me to say thank you so much for watching, and may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.